The parking lot outside Hargrove Financial's regional headquarters looked the way money always looks when it wants you to know it's there. Black sedans lined up in careful rows, not a fingerprint on any of them, the kind of clean that required other people's labor to maintain. And then there was the green minivan. It sat near the edge of the visitor lot like something that had wandered in from a different decade. The rear bumper carried a faded sticker from a children's museum in Cincinnati. One of the sliding door panels had a long thin scrape along its side, the kind left by a shopping cart in a grocery store parking lot, low enough to suggest the cart had been pushed by a child. The windshield had a crack running from the lower left corner toward the center. The kind that had been there long enough that the driver had stopped noticing it. On the back seat, visible through the window, a small pink backpack with a unicorn keychain clipped to the zipper, a library book, and a Ziploc bag of crackers. The van belonged to Theo Callahan. He was 41 years old, a structural engineer who had spent the last 3 years doing freelance consulting work from a home office that had once been a guest room, while also packing school lunches, learning which brands of shampoo his daughter preferred, and figuring out, slowly, imperfectly, how to be everything at once. He had not planned for this morning to go the way it went. But then, mornings rarely consult your plan. Theo had arrived 17 minutes early. This was not coincidence. He had mapped the route the night before, accounted for traffic, added buffer time, and still woken up at 5:40 a.m. Not by alarm, but by the particular anxiety of a man who understood that this meeting represented something larger than a contract. He had ironed his shirt, which he almost never did. He had found a tie in the back of the closet, tried it on, then taken it off again, because it belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed, and he didn't want to show up performing a character. He showed up as himself: gray slacks, the ironed blue shirt, good shoes, the kind of face that came from 3 years of loss and love running simultaneously. His daughter Nadia was 8. She had her mother's coloring and her father's habit of thinking very hard before saying anything. She had been dropped at school already, 40 minutes ago, and had made him promise he would be at pickup by 3. He had promised. He intended to keep it. Inside the lobby, he had signed in, received a visitor badge, and been told someone would come down shortly. He decided to wait outside. The lobby felt too polished, and he needed air. He walked back through the glass doors, stood near the entrance, and that was when he noticed the woman. She was perhaps 50, in a tailored charcoal blazer, heels that struck the concrete with a sound like small decisions being made. She was moving across the lot toward the building. Phone in one hand, the other raised to get the attention of one of the 2 security officers near the entrance canopy. She didn't slow her pace while she spoke to them. She pointed toward the visitor lot. Specifically, toward the green minivan. Theo didn't hear the full exchange. He caught fragments. Doesn't belong here. Have it removed. Before the board arrives. The security officer nodded twice, the way people nod when they've already decided that understanding is not required, only compliance. The woman was Sylvia Drummond. She was the chief operating officer of Hargrove Financial's regional division. She was not someone who tolerated disorder, and a beat-up green minivan parked near the executive entrance constituted, in her precise mental categorization, a form of disorder. She had not asked who it belonged to. Asking would have slowed things down. She had simply looked at the vehicle, made a calculation and acted. By the time Theo understood what was happening, a tow truck was already backing toward his van. He walked over quickly, not running. Running would have felt like panic, and Theo Callahan had learned to save his panic for things that truly warranted it. He explained to the tow operator that the van was his, that he was a registered visitor, that he could show the badge. The operator, with genuine apologetic neutrality, explained that he had a work order. Rules were rules, he was just doing his job. The security officer stepped in. Visitor or not, the vehicle had been flagged. If he wanted to contest it, he could speak to building management after the fact. The towing company would leave a card. Theo stood there and watched his van get lifted. The pink backpack was still on the back seat. Nadia's library book, the crackers she had left because she'd said she wasn't hungry this morning. He watched until the truck turned out of the lot and disappeared, and then he stood still for a moment with his hands at his sides, not moving, doing the thing he had gotten very good at doing since Claire died. absorbing something terrible without letting it pull him under, right there in public. Claire had been gone for 2 years and 4 months. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed 14 months before the end, which meant they'd had time, a specific, excruciating amount of time, to say everything, and also discover that some things resist being said no matter how much time you have. Nadia had been 6 when her mother died. She still sometimes set the table with 3 plates by accident, and when she noticed, she didn't cry. She just quietly put the 3rd one back. That was the detail that undid Theo most completely, in the small private moments when he let himself be undone. He adjusted the collar of his blue shirt. He looked at his watch. The meeting was in 11 minutes. He walked back inside. The conference room occupied the entire northeast corner of the 24th floor. It had the particular quality of expensive rooms. A quietness that felt engineered, temperature that felt controlled to the degree. Chairs that cost more than Theo's first car. Around the table sat 7 people. Hargrove Financial's board of regional directors. 2 outside consultants. A legal advisor who had flown in from Atlanta. They were in crisis. What the public did not know. What the company had gone to significant lengths to ensure the public did not know, was that Hargrove's regional infrastructure had a structural fault. Not in their finances, in their building. Specifically, in a portfolio of 14 commercial properties, they managed across 4 states, 11 of which had been constructed or significantly renovated between 2003 and 2011. A routine inspection 6 weeks ago had flagged anomalies in load-bearing assessments for 3 of those properties. Then a second inspection flagged 2 more. Then an independent review suggested the methodology used by their original engineering contractor, a firm that no longer existed, had applied modeling standards that were outdated even at the time. If the assessment held, they were looking at mandatory remediation across potentially 8 properties, regulatory exposure they hadn't begun to calculate, and liability conversations that made the legal advisor from Atlanta look like he hadn't slept in a week, because he hadn't. They had hired 3 engineering consultants in 5 weeks. The first 2 had produced reports that raised more questions than they answered. The 3rd had been quietly let go after it emerged he had a conflict of interest with one of the original contractors. Theo Callahan had been recommended by someone who knew someone who had worked with him in 2019 on a municipal infrastructure review in Columbus. That review had caught a problem that, the city engineer later admitted, would have cost them somewhere between $9 and $20 million if it had gone undetected another 18 months. Theo hadn't publicized this. He'd sent his invoice and moved on. He took his seat at the table without ceremony, opened the leather folder he'd brought, worn at the corners, with a water stain on the back, and uncapped a pen. The board chair, a man named Garrett Albright, thanked him for coming. Someone else, a director named Fiona Park, gave a compressed overview of the situation. Theo listened and took notes, not elaborate notes, just the kind that told you what questions to ask. Then he started asking them, not in an adversarial way, not to perform expertise. He asked the way a doctor asks when they're actually trying to understand something, rather than confirm what they already decided. He asked about the inspection methodology, the building permits, the remediation timelines from the original contractor, the soil classification data for 2 of the flagged sites, whether the 2009 renovation on the Dayton property had gone through independent structural review, or relied on the contractor's internal sign-off. The room shifted. It did not shift dramatically. It was not a movie. No one gasped. But there was a particular quality that entered the silence between his questions and their answers. Something like recognition, the sensation of being in the presence of someone who actually understood the material rather than someone who was managing it. The board chair asked him to walk them through what he was seeing. Theo uncapped his pen and spent the next 40 minutes talking. He explained that 2 of the 5 flagged properties had been flagged incorrectly. The anomalies were real, but they were cosmetic, not structural, and the remediation estimate for those 2 alone was inflated by approximately 60% due to a misclassification of the load-bearing system type. He explained that one of the 3 remaining properties was genuinely serious and needed immediate attention. He explained that the other 2 fell into a middle category that required a more nuanced assessment protocol, one that did not yet exist in standard practice, but that he could design. He had in fact already sketched the outlines of it that morning in the parking lot while waiting to come up. He had done this in the minivan, with a legal pad on the steering wheel, because he had arrived early and hadn't wanted to sit in the lobby. This is what Theo Callahan's preparation looked like. Not perfectly appointed, just thorough. When he finished, there was a silence of the kind that follows something useful. Garrett Albright said quietly, "What would it take to bring you on exclusively for the duration of this remediation process?" Other voices followed. The legal advisor said something about scope of engagement. Fiona Park mentioned retention terms. Another director asked about his current commitments, his availability, whether he had a team or worked independently. Theo answered the questions. Then he looked at his watch and said there was something he needed to address. He needed to leave in time to pick up his daughter from school. She was 8, and he had promised her, and he did not break promises to her if he could help it. He would need his van for that. The room went quiet. He said it simply, without drama. His van had been towed from the lot about an hour ago. He wasn't sure of the exact process for retrieval. The quiet in the room changed character. Several pairs of eyes moved, not quickly, not accusatorially, but with the gravitational inevitability of people doing math, to the empty chair at the far end of the table. Sylvia Drummond's chair. She had stepped out 20 minutes into the meeting to take a call, and had not returned. Garrett Albright's jaw worked slightly. Fiona Park set down her pen. The legal advisor, a man named Charles Webb, was already looking at his phone. He passed it quietly to an assistant who had been sitting along the wall. Within 4 minutes, someone had reached the towing company. Within 9 minutes, there was a confirmed address for the impound lot. Within 12 minutes, a driver from the building's executive car service had been dispatched to retrieve the vehicle personally, at the company's expense, and deliver it to the front entrance. Theo did not ask for any of this. He had stated a logistical reality. The room had responded not out of guilt management. Though guilt was certainly present, but out of the particular urgency that arrives when an organization realizes it has, through someone else's carelessness, insulted the one person it desperately needs to trust them. Sylvia Drummond returned to the room approximately 7 minutes. After all of this had been set in motion, she was told what had happened in a way that was brief and unsparing. The look on her face was not one of outrage or defensiveness. It was something quieter and harder to watch. It was the face of a person who had spent 20 years building a reputation for precise, intelligent judgment, and who had just discovered that her instincts, on this particular morning, had failed her entirely, based on nothing more substantive than the appearance of a vehicle. She asked to speak with Theo alone for a moment, in the small adjoining room used for breakout sessions. He agreed. She did not make a speech. She did not explain herself or provide context for her thinking, or describe the pressures she was under. She said she had made an assumption, it was wrong, and she was sorry. Not sorry in the way that organizations are sorry, through statements and processes. She was sorry in the way that people are sorry when they recognize themselves in a mistake they wish they hadn't made. Theo listened. Then he said he appreciated that. He said he understood the impulse. He'd made assumptions about people before and been wrong. He said it without edge, he meant it. They walked back into the conference room. The conversation that followed was the practical kind. Terms were discussed, scope was defined, a preliminary agreement was sketched out that would be formalized within the week. The number attached to the exclusive engagement was, by Theo's standards, significant. By the board's standards, given what they stood to save, it was not. He was back in the elevator at 2:14 p.m. In the lobby, he found his green minivan already waiting near the entrance, returned, refueled, the crack in the windshield unchanged, which was fine, because the crack had been there for 8 months, and it didn't compromise the glass structurally, he had checked. The pink backpack was still on the back seat, the library book, the cracker bag. He drove to Nadia's school. He was 11 minutes early. She came out in the first wave, saw him, and walked over with the particular dignity of an 8-year-old, who has decided that running to greet her father is something she's slightly too old for but still ends up doing anyway. She got in the passenger seat. She had recently transitioned from the back, a milestone she had announced with great seriousness, and buckled her seatbelt and said without preamble, "I have a lot of homework," he said. "I know." She looked at him. She had her mother's way of reading faces, the kind that didn't miss much. She said, "Did it go okay?" He said, "Yeah, I think it did." She nodded, satisfied. She pulled her library book out of her backpack and opened it. They drove. 3 weeks later, Theo signed the formal agreement with Hargrove Financial. The engagement covered 14 months, and included a consulting fee that, when he deposited the first payment, required him to sit still in his car for a minute before starting the engine, just to let it be real. He paid off the last of Claire's medical debt. A number he had carried so long it had started to feel like a fixed feature of his life, like the crack in the windshield, something he'd stopped expecting to disappear. He set up an education account for Nadia. He fixed the van's sliding door panel, the one with the scrape from the grocery cart. He did not buy a new van. There was no particular logic to this. He could have afforded one now, comfortably. But the van was the van. It had taken Nadia to her first day of kindergarten, and to the hospital the night Claire's condition shifted, and to 7 different school events in the past year, and to the Children's Museum in Cincinnati, where the bumper sticker had come from. That trip, 3 months after Claire died, which had been Theo's first real attempt at giving Nadia an ordinary day. The day had been imperfect and exhausting, and also, somewhere in the middle of it, genuinely good. He didn't need to explain any of this to anyone. He just didn't replace it. At Hargrove, people talked about that morning, the way people talk about things that clarify something about where they work, and who makes decisions, and what those decisions reveal. Sylvia Drummond did not leave the company. She remained COO. She was, by most measures, good at the job. But she was also, quietly, different after that day. Not worse, not diminished, just more careful about the particular kind of certainty that had led her to that parking lot with her phone in her hand, and no questions asked. The remediation project proceeded on Theo's timeline. 2 of the 5 flagged properties were cleared within 6 weeks. The one genuinely serious property was addressed over 4 months, with a corrective plan that Theo designed and oversaw. The new assessment protocol he developed became, within a year, the basis for a revised industry standard in the state. He was not famous for this. He did not seek to be. He was home every afternoon by 3:15, that part he did not negotiate away. On a Friday in November, Nadia found the original visitor badge from Hargrove, the paper kind, with his name printed on it, in the glove box of the van. She held it up and asked what it was. He told her it was from a meeting. She asked if it was an important meeting. He thought about the tow truck, and the boardroom, and Sylvia Drummond's quiet apology, and the first payment sitting in an account that would one day pay for 4 years of whatever Nadia decided she wanted to become. He said, "Yeah, it turned out to be a pretty important one." She looked at the badge a moment longer with the serious expression she wore when she was deciding whether something warranted further inquiry, and then she put it back in the glove box and returned to her book. He started the engine. The van made the low rattlings sound it always made when it idled. The crack in the windshield caught the afternoon light in the way it always did. He pulled out of the school lot, and drove home with his daughter beside him, in the green minivan that people had misjudged and underestimated, and then spent the better part of a morning trying to bring back.